Hey, everybody, welcome to That Expert Show, where you help run the show. I'm Anna Canzano. Thanks so much for joining us for this episode, in which we're talking about domestic violence. October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and just a statistic to start things off, nearly 20 people per minute are physically abused by an intimate partner here in the United States. That's every minute, 20 people per minute. And that adds up to nearly 10 million men and women who are physically abused by an intimate partner here in our country every year. The statistics are very troubling. And obviously, this is an issue that impacts so many people. If you, in fact, believe that you are experiencing abuse, if you're even concerned that you are experiencing abuse, or you are living in fear of your own safety or the safety of your children or your pets, I encourage you right now to text the word START to 88788. That's 88788. Or there is help. You can call the National Domestic Violence Hotline. That's at 1-800-787 SAFE. And we will have that information for you as well on our tip sheet, which we'll provide at the end of the episode. But it's important for you to know that no one deserves to be abused. The abuse is not your fault, and you are not alone. We have an expert lined up to talk with us tonight about domestic violence. He is the Washington County District Attorney in Oregon, Kevin Barton, and he joins us live right now. Mr. Barton, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Domestic violence is one of those tricky things because I think most of us think of domestic violence and we probably have some kind of image of in our head about what a victim looks like and what a perpetrator looks like for whatever reason, based on whatever experiences we've had or how we've seen domestic violence portrayed in the media. But can you help us understand how the law defines domestic violence and basically how to identify it?
Absolutely. Well, the first thing to know about domestic violence is it's widespread. And for years, going back 20, 30 years ago, there was a perception in our community that domestic violence was a family matter. And that's something that we have worked hard to shake, because what we've come to realize is it's not something that should be kept behind closed doors, but we need to shine the light on what's happening so that people who are being victimized in an abusive relationship can have access to services and the support that they need to get out of that abusive relationship. There's no such thing as a typical domestic violence victim. So there are many myths about domestic violence, and one of them is that it only impacts women, or that it only impacts people who are of a certain socioeconomic background. And that's just flat out not true. Domestic violence, or DV as some people call it, really impacts every member, or every different type of member in our community, throughout all different areas of our state. And it's something that we've worked hard to provide resources for people so that they can pull themselves out of that abusive relationship.
For somebody who's watching right now who might be concerned that they themselves are a victim of violence, or they perhaps know somebody who is, what are some of the warning signs? What are the red flags that people can watch for in their relationships or the relationships of people who they know?
There's different forms when we talk about domestic violence. The most typical one that I think people think of is physical. So obviously things like bruises on someone's arm, red marks on someone's neck or on someone's wrists, some physical signs that you might see. But there's different types of domestic violence beyond just the physical. There's also emotional violence, where you have a controlling partner, someone who will not allow their partner to go do things or have a life of their own, controlling them when it comes to money or their activities. There's also emotional domestic violence, where you can have someone who's using the threat of emotions or the control of emotions to try and control their intimate partner. So if you're looking and you're wondering what are the signs, really it's looking for a change in behavior. It's looking for some physical signs, people that can be withdrawn, low self-esteem, statements about harming themselves or wanting to find help. Those are some of the early warning signs that you can look for.
And I do want to invite viewers who are watching with us live right now, if you're watching us via Facebook or through our partnership with the Oregonian, I invite you to post your questions and your comments right now. We'll be monitoring those as this interview goes along. And if you have questions for Mr. Barton, I'm happy to mediate those questions on your behalf. It's interesting because when you think about domestic violence and relationship abuse, I would imagine that most relationships don't start out with these signs of abuse. That's kind of the tricky thing about relationship abuse, is that it just starts to creep in, and that the abuser finds ways to gain power and control over the victim. Can you help us understand that dynamic a little bit?
That's absolutely right. So, in fact, that phrase "power and control" is something that is definitely present in a lot of abusive relationships. So, usually it starts out small. So, an abuser might start with some verbal manipulation, where the abuser might try to control where the other person goes or what the other person does. Try to control who their friends might be or their social circles. Might look at their phone and start trying to control some of who they're allowed to talk to and text with, and then using that power that the abuser has. And it doesn't have to be physical, although it certainly can be. It can start with things like controlling the money that a partner is allowed to use, or controlling who they're allowed to talk to and when, and wanting to know where they are at all times. And then eventually it can very quickly cycle into a situation with physical control on top of that emotional or other control. And sometimes it can be a cycle where it crescendos, and then there can be an incident, and then the abuser apologizes and says, "I won't do it again." And then the person who's been abused thinks, "Well, I'll give him one more chance." And then it just gets worse and worse over time, to a point where sometimes people find themselves stuck. They've been isolated. They don't have their circle of friends and the network, because the abuser has shrunk that as to the extent that they can, and then it's hard for a person to remove themselves from that abusive relationship.
Well, and I can only imagine when you say the word isolation, I'm thinking about COVID and how the pandemic has impacted situations like this that were dicey to begin with.
That's exactly right. So, really, the recipe for domestic violence is social stress and isolation. And so, as we saw with COVID, stress and isolation increased, and we noticed the very same thing was happening with domestic violence. The other interesting thing to note about crimes like domestic violence, there can be a disconnect between the what we know about, what gets reported to police, and what we know is actually happening behind the scenes. We see the same thing with child abuse crimes. We see the same thing with sexual assault crimes. So, for example, the very week in Washington County that schools shut down in March of 2020, and any parent would remember that week quite well, we saw a drop in child abuse reports by about half. But we knew that child abuse had not dropped by half that same week, because, in fact, what was happening, the children didn't have access to the teachers who they would normally tell the abuse to, who would then report it. Same dynamic happening with domestic violence, where you have intimate partners who are injuring one another. We saw a drop in the reports initially, and then we saw a rise after that, as people were adapting to the new environment with COVID. So we're very concerned about that disconnect between what's actually happening and what we know about that gets reported.
No, that's interesting. We had a viewer write into the show on that topic. Similarly, they were saying that there was controversy over children's virtual school attendance because abused children need to be away from home so they could be abused less at home. And this viewer wanted to know whether Children's Services agreed that the concept that fewer hours of abuse was acceptable. I think they meant to say that, basically drawing a correlation, like you were saying, that children being away from home had at least an opportunity to escape when they were at school.
I believe that's right. And, the world of a child, and child abuse is like domestic violence, where you have essentially the power and control dynamic. The role of world of a child is relatively small. It's their family, it's their social network, their friends, and it's school. And so when we removed school during COVID, we really removed that element where they could reach out for help and tell a teacher or tell a counselor about what was happening. And that's when we saw a significant drop in the report of child abuse, even though we knew the incident, the actual occurrence of child abuse, was continuing and probably increasing. Same issue with domestic violence, where we removed the ability for people to have access to help as we shut down society in 2020. And we saw an increase in the prevalence of domestic violence. And now we're dealing with the after effect of that as people are finally coming forward and reporting what's been happening to them over these many months.
That is just so heartbreaking. We had several people write in about the violence that is perpetrated by women against men, and the statistics that were showing that it's almost as common as violence perpetrated by men, but it's underreported because of prejudice and other issues. And another viewer said that, they really were hoping that we would talk about women committing violence against their male partners, that it's a significant issue, but it's so difficult for men to be taken seriously that it tends to only be reported anonymously. Do you find that to be the case? Can we talk about the gender roles and the reality of that?
Yes, absolutely. So it's true that the most common form that is reported is the one where a male is the perpetrator and a female is the victim. But it's also true that there is quite a bit of violence where the male is the victim and the female is a perpetrator. And there's also, we should say, female, female, and male, male. So in our modern society, we understand that there's many different types of relationships. And domestic violence doesn't play favorites. It occurs in all different types of relationships. The key ingredients are the power and the control that we talked about earlier, and those can be present in any type of relationship that exists. The statistics do bear out that about 1 in 4 women in the US has been a victim of domestic violence in her lifetime. And depending on where you look for a source, it can be anywhere between 1 in 4 and 1 in 7 men have been victims of domestic violence at some point in their lifetime.
Can we talk a little bit then about the safety plan for anyone who's listening to this that might think that they need to get help and get out, or somebody who has a loved one that they're concerned about? How does somebody even go about defining for themselves whether they're in a situation like this and then starting to think about a safety plan of what to do?
That's a great question. And as depressing as this topic can be, the good news is there is a wealth of resource available out there to help people who are in this situation. The first step that someone can do if they're in a safe place is simply Google help, I'm in a domestic violence, or help me DV. You can Google words just like that, and all sorts of resources will pop up. Now, I do need to say that if you're in an environment where you may not be safe, you also need to remember that your abuser might have access to your phone or your internet search history. So it's important that you do that in a safe way. But the key is reaching out and getting help. And when you do reach out and get help, whether it's a trusted friend, perhaps a family member outside your small family circle, or a service provider in your community, when you get that help, you'll find that there are steps you can take. And one of them is called a safety plan, where you literally plan out how can I be safe when I'm in this situation and how can I remove myself from it. And there are some simple steps that you can take, such as getting a phone to call 911 in case you need to, a separate extra phone. Many may not realize this, but any phone that is operable, even if it doesn't have a cell phone plan associated with it, can still call 911. Or putting some money aside so that if you have to leave in a hurry, you'll have some money just to tide you over in that moment. Or you're putting your documents in a safe place. So if you do have to leave, you can take your key documents like your driver's license or your passport or your credit card. So those types of steps are really important as part of a safety plan, but there's people out there that can help you formulate that plan.
I cannot imagine being in that situation and how scary that would be. And like you're saying, because of a lot of this violence is just sort of the monitoring of a victim's behavior. So it's like somebody might be scared to even go on their home computer, their home laptop, or their phone and make a search like that to figure out what the resources might be. In a situation like you've seen in the last couple of years, then, has it been more challenging for your office to hold offenders accountable?
It has. And one of the challenges we always see in domestic violence cases is the longer these cases take, the more time that passes between when the victim calls police and gets that help. the more difficult it can be, because that abuser is still trying to exert that power and control that we talked about earlier. And so with COVID, what we've seen is our court system has really slowed down significantly. It's taken a lot longer to move cases through the pipeline because of all the social distancing issues and factors that we're all fully aware of now. And as that's happened, it's been a lot harder on victims who've now had to just wait for that case to progress. And, for many of these people, they're dealing with their entire family that's caught up in this entire situation. So you've got kids at play, you've got a job situation, you've got where do I live, where do I sleep? And the longer these cases take, the more difficult it can be.
Well, and not to mention even just, I would love to ask you about restraining orders because I think there's been a lot of chat about those in the media, especially in the last few weeks, about what happens when a victim goes to a court system and obtains a restraining order. First of all, are restraining orders hard to get? Like, what is the requirement for a restraining order? And really, does it offer much protection in the end? Because I think a lot of people think, well, it's just a piece of paper. How is that going to protect me?
Right. Restraining orders are a really important tool to protect victims, and there are many resources out there to help people get restraining orders. So there are some standards that have to be met, some legal standards, in order to obtain that restraining order. For example, if you are in an abusive environment, there has to be a showing that you've been physically harmed or that someone has tried to harm you in order to obtain a restraining order. However, when you make that showing, and you can do that with help and resources from many different providers that are out there just waiting to help people get those restraining orders in court, when you do obtain that restraining order, then you do have some level of protection where if your abuser does violate that, then there can be some consequences to help keep him or her separate from you. In Washington County, for example, we have a place called the Family Justice Center of Washington County, and it's essentially a one-stop shopping center for people who are in an abusive environment. So if you're, let's say, a person living in an abusive situation and you want to find a way to get out of that, you can go to a website, the Family Justice Center of Washington County, where you can call a number and you can show up at the doorstep of the Family Justice Center, and they can help you there do things like safety planning or getting a restraining order in court remotely. So you don't have to physically go to the courthouse, but you can meet with an attorney at the Family Justice Center who can then walk you through the process, and you can attend court remotely, just as you and I are talking right now, and get access to that restraining order.
Oh, wow. I didn't even know that was available. How long has that been in place?
We've had the Family Justice Center now for 3 years,
Okay.
and it's been a great resource for our Washington County community. And there's similar resources in Multnomah County and in Clackamas County to help walk people through this so that we lower the barrier so that they can access those services.
Now, this is interesting because that ease of access can also be used improperly. There's someone on Facebook writing in right now who's watching us live. Thanks very much. Kurao, I believe, I'm probably mispronouncing that, wants to know how do victims deal with the abuser using the system to continue to abuse?
Well, I'm not quite sure what that person is asking about, and so what I can tell you is the system is it's it's a difficult process for a crime victim to go through. The system was never designed, I think, with domestic violence victims and survivors in mind. And so we've got many people who work within the system who do understand that dynamic. And so, for example, the different police departments have what are called victim advocates, and the DA's offices also have victim advocates. And these are social workers who are designed, whose mission is to help walk a crime victim through the criminal process, so that as a crime victim, that person can understand what their rights are in the process. And victims have rights just as people accused of crimes have rights. And then also there's attorneys out there who can represent victims who might have issues that need a legal representation for. So there's resources we can connect people up with to help protect them so that they are not subject to further abuse as they're working through the criminal system.
Well, and these same people, I mean, they know what they're doing. A lot of them have been working in the system and are familiar with the faces and the type of personalities that come through. So I assume they also have a keen eye to when a potential abuser is actually using the system against the victim, because I would assume that's part of that process. Another person writing in on Facebook says that they are co-parenting with someone in a dangerous situation, and they don't know what to do. They're saying that this person is terrified to do anything in fear of her abuser taking the next step. What advice can you offer that
Well, the
gentleman?
first, yeah, thank you for that. I would say the first thing is reach out for help. So again, depending on the community that you live in, there are plenty of resources available where you can have that conversation and you can find out first, am I in an abusive relationship? And signs of an abusive relationship can be things like emotional control or behavioral control or physical control that we've talked about earlier. Are you being isolated or not? If you come to the realization that you might be in an abusive relationship, then it's so important to reach out and talk to someone who can walk you through steps you can take to protect yourself, to protect your children, to make sure that they're safe as well, and that you can also make steps to remove yourself from that relationship if you need to. And thinking of children, I do want to say that a significant issue that we see is what's called co-occurring, where we have both domestic violence and child abuse happening at the same time. We recently looked at the children in Washington County who are victims of child abuse, who are seen at a medical clinic for their child abuse situation, whether they're sexual victims or physical victims. And close to half of the children in Washington County who are abused as children also live in homes with domestic violence. So we should not forget about the impact of that domestic violence on the children in the home as well.
And typically, I mean, it's not just one type of abuse, right? Like, can you confirm for me? Like, I would imagine that somebody who is in a physically abusive relationship is also being emotionally or socially abused as well in some way.
That's right. That's exactly correct. So we see physical abuse, we see emotional abuse, we see sexual abuse. The power and control dynamic that manifests itself in the physical relationship carries through in the other aspects of a relationship.
And Mr. Barton, help me understand. Tell me if this is a silly question, but can you try to answer the question of why do abusers abuse? Is it because they abused or they were victims themselves, or is that not always the case?
That's not always the case. So, boy, that's if I could answer that question, I think we would be able to make a big step at solving this problem of domestic violence and of abuse. It is very frequent though that behavior is learned, and so we do know that the odds of a person growing up and becoming an abuser do increase if that person comes from a home where they've either been subjected to abuse themselves or where they've witnessed that happening to a parent or to a family member. But there's other reasons that people abuse too, and we know, for example, that sometimes alcohol and drugs can add fuel to the fire, but they don't cause the abuse. They sometimes can exacerbate the abuse. And then sometimes stress and the very issues that we're seeing now with COVID, stress and whether it's economic stress or social stress, can be some of the ingredients that lead towards some of the abuse. But really, we're dealing with that power and control that you mentioned earlier.
And your advice, Mr. Barton, for somebody who's listening now who has a loved one they're concerned about, they've been watching, there are signs, there's a pattern developing, there are bruises or other types of signals that something is simply toxic in that relationship. What would you tell somebody who wants to intervene, who wants to help someone they believe is a victim in an abusive relationship?
I would say first, start a conversation. Reach out to that person. Ask them, "Are you okay?" Or, "I'm concerned. I've noticed these things." Look for the signs, the physical signs, the emotional, the behavior signs. Listen to what that person has to say without judgment, but just listen to that person so you can be a receptive and a kind ear. Believe what they have to say, and then help them reach out for support, whether it's forming a safety plan, like we've discussed earlier, calling 911 if there's an emergency, calling non emergency numbers if you just want to reach out for help, or calling one of these social service agencies that provides domestic violence support. And then knowing that there's people out there, there is an army of people out there who want to help domestic violence victims and survivors leave that abusive environment and live a good and safe life.
So much of the time, though, the victim does not want to acknowledge the situation that they're in. It's almost like it's more comfortable for them to live in a state of denial and make excuses for what's happening, blame themselves, than, have an accurate assessment of what is happening.
It's a complex and a dynamic situation because we're not just dealing with an abusive environment in a bubble. We're dealing with a family, which can be messy. We're dealing with kids sometimes at play with, the rent check is due and he's got to work to make rent. And if I call to report this, then how can he make rent?
Right.
We're dealing with where do I live or will I be embarrassed? And so there's a lot of issues at play there. And we know that abuse victims reach out or try to reach out many, many times before they successfully actually leave an abusive relationship and get help.
Thanks so much for your information today. Any last words that answers to questions I wasn't smart enough to ask you?
No, you've done a great job. And the key is for your listeners, and there is help. And just know that there's people out there that want to provide that help so that we can make sure everyone can live in a safe community.
All right, Mr. Barton, thanks for your good work out there in Washington County.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of That Expert Show. Again, the numbers to call, 1-800-787-SAFE, 800-787-SAFE, or you can text the word START to 88788. We will put that information in the tip sheet that we will create after this episode, summarizing Mr. Barton's key points, as well as resources that you can turn to. We'll have that posted on our website, thatexpertshow.com. You can also listen to this show as a podcast. You can pass it along as well from Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts or wherever it is that you get your audio content. We also post all episodes on YouTube. Reach out to me. I'd love to hear from you, get your feedback on this episode or your ideas for topics and experts that I should interview next. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Just look for Anna Canzano. Thanks so much for being part of That Expert Show. It is a dialogue. I appreciate everyone who tuned in and offered comments and had questions for Mr. Barton. That is the beauty of this show, that it really is a dialogue between me and you and the expert that we feature on a given night. We're on Monday evenings, live on Facebook through the Oregonian and all the other channels afterwards as well. Thanks for being part of That Expert Show, where you help run the show.